Morning, everyone. I'm Katy Bass. I'm the research director at the Knight Institute. Just going to take a minute to get settled. Really nice to see people in a room together again for an event. This is the first major conference we have done in person since 2019. But we're also hybrid now. So we have a sizable online audience watching on the live stream. Thank you all for joining us as well. And the online viewers will be able to participate in the Q&A portion as well. They will be able to feed questions in to the YouTube chat, and then those will come up to me and our other moderators on this iPad here. So we'll be very inclusive. All right, so we're here with a really great panel today and some really great papers to discuss. I'm going to start from the farthest away from me. RonNell Andersen Jones is the Teitelbaum Chair and Professor of Law at the University of Utah S.J. Quinney College of Law. Sam Lebovic is an Associate Professor of History at George Mason University. Sonja West is the Brumby Distinguished Professor in First Amendment Law at the University of Georgia School of Law. And John Witt is Alan H. Duffy, Class of 1960 Professor of Law at Yale Law School. Thank you all for being here. So this panel is called Lies in Historical Context, and some of our opening remarks have set us up nicely for this. What I'm hoping to do today is to put what we're dealing with now in some historical perspective, and also to draw out some threads that I hope the other panels today will take up in their conversations later on. There's an assumption that I notice in many of the debates that we're currently having over lies in public discourse and misinformation and disinformation. And that is, many people, not everyone, but many, seem to believe that there was some time somewhere in the past where things were better from an information perspective or from a healthy discourse perspective, even if they acknowledge that there were more gatekeepers in those days, and as a result, there was less variety of information available to the public, or there were less diversity of voices in the public sphere. I still often get the impression that people believe things used to be better and now they're worse. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit and to what extent that's true. And we're also going to think about legal history. So how previous generations thought about the First Amendment, what they thought about the utility of fighting for expressive rights in court, and also how the Supreme Court's own view of First Amendment protections has changed over time. So to start us off, we're going to do short presentations of each paper, just 3 to 5 minutes, and then we'll come back and fill in more detail from each of these rich papers throughout our discussion. But to start us off, I'm wondering if Sam could give us a brief introduction to his paper. Please go ahead.
Okay, I can. I'm a historian, so there's a sort of standard historical argument, which is that things have been worse for longer than you think. And that's really the sum total of my intervention. I begin with Walter Lippmann in 1919 and his sort of early work, Liberty in the News, which is a sort of slim volume that sets up his treatment of public opinion later in the 1920s. And from that early work, I take a couple of ideas that I think are helpful in contextualizing the current problem. The first is he has a sort of withering critique of kind of naive theories of democratic public opinion based on the idea of what he calls the omnicompetent citizen, the idea that we're sort of spontaneously all going to know everything. And if we can just express our opinions, the marketplace will kind of rationalize that into something sort of workable. And he's got a lot of reasons for thinking that doesn't work. But if you read his critique in 1919, it sounds very similar to a lot of the panic that we have today about, oh my God, people don't believe rational things and they come to sort of foolish conclusions and they act like a mob. I mean, he's writing in 1919 when there's racial pogroms throughout the US cities, there's a pandemic killing hundreds of thousands. I mean, the resonances should be familiar. And then the second idea he has is that actually we shouldn't be thinking about the problems of public opinion exclusively through the lens of civil liberties and the rights of expression, that this sort of doubles down on the idea of thinking that public opinion should work through a kind of marketplace of individual expression. And he says that's not the key issue. The key issue is the stream of news upon which opinions are based. So rather than trying to sort of tinker with civil liberties, and he's articulating this idea as Oliver Wendell Holmes is kind of dissenting in Abrams, he says we need to get behind the scenes to what really matters, which is how does information circulate in the media economy generally, and are the relevant sources of information being produced? His argument in 1919 is that they aren't. And I sort of take those two arguments forward to the contemporary moment to say that I think we're back in the same debate and in the same problems, where people see a kind of democratic public sphere that's not working the way that they would like, and they're looking to blame the sort of problems of individual citizens, thinking that they're lacking competence in some particular capacity, or they're being misled by sort of really disgusting, upsetting, obviously incoherent or incorrect opinions. So I don't want to take too much time. I want to get onto a conversation. But basically the idea is, on the one hand, to say there's nothing particularly new about the contemporary crisis. And I do make this argument in two ways. The first is just sort of cutting it down to size a little bit by looking at the fact that there was plenty of lying in the golden age of the post-World War II era. I look at McCarthyism and massive resistance as the kind of two key instances of when the media was supposed to be functioning at its best. You have really noxious opinions circulating that look pretty familiar. And then secondly, the current crisis, or, when you look at the social scientific literature, which I'm not an expert on, but I have read, there's not as much lying going on as we think. There's a sort of a smaller percentage of people circulating information that then get amplified through a kind of right-wing media formation. And that, again, looks quite familiar to what happened in the 1940s. The real problem, I argue, is that journalism has had a crisis, the collapse of the newsrooms, the decline of reporters, which means that what is circulating in the news is increasingly just opinion, right? And sort of highlights and emphasizes those small networks of kind of really outrageous speechifying. To take that on by trying to think about civil liberties and civil opinion, public opinion, I think is the wrong move, because it's sort of leaning directly into the whirlwind, right? I mean, it's trying to deal with contemporary problems of politics by fixing speech, by trying to rule certain types of speech out. And that is a kind of culture war that is really causing a lot of the problems in American democracy now. The better strategy, I argue, again, drawing from Lippmann, is to pay attention to the production of information that's needed for democratic life. And that requires, I think, what Lippmann called the creation of political observatories, sort of small organizations devoted to new forms of reporting, not opinion, not commentary, not trying to make sure that members of the public think anything in particular about politics, but just that the raw information about local politics, local elections, local school boards is available and reported, so people can then construct a democratic politics on the basis of that. So that's the kind of nutshell of an argument, but I look forward to talking about it with you all.
That's great. Thank you, Sam. So I have one question for you, and then I'm going to ask John to talk about his paper, which also features Walter Lippmann in a slightly different take. So that is, from your historian's perspective, is there truly nothing that you think is new or unique about this current moment? Is this really, would Lippmann be not at all surprised by what we're dealing with right now? Or is there something about what's happening now that is really unprecedented?
I mean, there's obviously some things that are new. I mean, not least, everything that happened before had already happened. I mean, we're sort of living with the consequences of 70 years of, problematic public opinion, and the sort of the rot that comes from that is, I think, deep and real. So, one of the things I often think about is that some of the worst lies in American history relate to foreign policy, right? I mean, sort of setting up the Vietnam War, Iran-Contra, weapons of mass destruction, right? And the kind of the cynicism that comes out of those is cumulative and real. And so that's not something that can just be kind of forgotten or a line can be drawn under. I also think that the crisis of reporting has accelerated radically and is a new problem. I mean, 40% of journalism jobs in the country disappeared in the first decades of the 21st century. That intersected with a sort of massive proliferation of media channels that have been filled with commentary, a kind of outrage industry. It's cheap, it's easy to produce, people pay attention to it. And that has nationalized politics in, I think, an unusual way. So that politics isn't embedded really now in local institutions or intermediating institutions or local communities, but we're all reacting to the same set of actors and stories. And it's given politics a kind of a particularly unreal or hyper-real kind of vibe. So those are new, but I think that the underlying conditions are not.
Thank you. John, would you like to talk about yours now?
Sure. Thanks so much, Katie. It's a real pleasure to be here. I was at Columbia for a long time, so it's always nice to come back. And this is a great symposium to be involved in. Thanks, Genevieve, for putting it together. So my interest in this emerged out of an observation that the histories of the beginning of the modern First Amendment tradition, which is a story that starts in the fall of 1919, is now one of the canonical stories for law students, for historians, for students of American politics, that those histories have a variety of persistent optimisms in them, the literature of that moment. Some of those optimisms are about marketplaces of truth and might be associated with a certain vision of Oliver Wendell Holmes, or some of them might be about an optimism about democratic flourishing in the public sphere and might be associated with Louis Brandeis and others like him. Or maybe there's an optimism about the discovery of a new system of managing dangerous radicalisms, a sunlight strategy or a steam vent strategy. In any event, three and more, I'm sure, optimisms about what this discovery of the modern First Amendment in the form of the dissents in the fall of 1919 might mean. But what these optimisms do is they separate the beginning of the First Amendment tradition, on the one hand, from the discovery that speech is dangerous and distorting and full of misrepresentation in our time. They separate those two things and make them separate. And so the paper that I've written proposes to bring them together. It proposes what we might call, though I don't think I used this phrase in the paper, a simultaneity thesis. That is to say, the fall of 1919 is a moment of two things: the discovery of the modern First Amendment tradition on the one hand, and the discovery that speech in the democratic public sphere is incredibly dangerous and subject to misrepresentation and lies and pervasive exercise of power. And thus my title, drawing from Elena Kagan's dissent a few years ago, the title of the paper is Weaponized from the Beginning, since Kagan is observing that speech is being weaponized in our moment. So how do I tell the story of the simultaneity thesis? Well, I focus on two characters, although one could really tell the story in any number of ways. And the two characters I draw out are, one, Walter Lippmann, whom Sam's begun with. It's not a surprise that I would start with Walter Lippmann or look a little like Sam in that, since I've been learning from Sam about this subject for a number of years now. And Lippmann's really an unavoidable character in the story. And I think my version of Lippmann looks a lot like Sam's, although there's some interesting divergences that I'll touch on in a minute in other respects of the paper. But a second character whom I bring out, who I think maybe it would be useful to have on the table here for the history of the simultaneous discovery of the First Amendment and discovery of misrepresentation and lies in the public sphere, is Roger Baldwin, whom some of you will know as the founder of the ACLU in 1920. So just a year later, in the fall of 1919, he's getting out of prison, where he'd spent a year as a conscientious objector. And where Walter Lippmann goes, where Roger Baldwin goes in the fall of 1919, is Pittsburgh. And I think it's worth just dwelling on Roger Baldwin in Pittsburgh in the fall of 1919, about to produce the Modern Civil Liberties Project, already deeply involved in it during the war. And why is Baldwin in Pittsburgh? It's the Great Steel Strike of the fall of 1919. And Baldwin goes to Pittsburgh to be part of, he actually functions as a labor side spy inside US Steel and doing sort of fascinating work on behalf of the unions. But Baldwin's observation there, which Lippmann is making too, when Lippmann looks at Pittsburgh, and Lippmann writes about Pittsburgh in Public Opinion, is that US Steel is completely controlling the information economy of Western Pennsylvania. That there is a news blackout other than what the US Steel propaganda arm is delivering. And so Baldwin enters the 20s and enters his civil liberties project as someone focused on information economies and the political economy of information. And I think that's crucial to see, that at the beginning of the ACLU's First Amendment tradition is this relentless focus on the problem of the public sphere in a world of power inequalities and of information that can be exploited and distorted and the like. Both Lippmann and Baldwin are, in a sense, students of information in crisis. And they are part of a whole generation of people focused on information in crisis. Lippmann's teacher, Graham Wallas, who coins the phrase "the Great Society," does so to try to explain how information works in a world in the world of the mass. in the world in which we can't be, as Sam's paper brings out, omnicompetent citizens, because information is not available in firsthand, but rather secondhand and comes through sources. But in England, Norman Angell; in Germany, Karl Mannheim; in Italy, Anthony Gramsci. I mean, all of these people are scholars of information in crisis in the early 20th century. So what might be some of the implications of the simultaneity thesis? I mean, why would it matter if, in fact, the discovery of the First Amendment comes simultaneous with the discovery of its misrepresentation and the problem of distortion and lies in the public sphere? Well, I think actually a bunch of things follow that might be kind of interesting to follow during the conversation and maybe for the rest of the day. I mean, one is that the misinformation problem is consistent with many First Amendment regimes. I'm describing the fall of 1919 as the discovery of the First Amendment, but of course, that's by two lonely dissenters, right? That is to say, there is no First Amendment protection in the modern way that we're going to become familiar with once the Holmes and Brandeis dissents become majority opinions starting in the early 1930s, more or less. So it's consistent with many First Amendment regimes, the problem of misinformation, but it's also consistent with many technological regimes. That is, the information technology, it appears that misrepresentations and lies exist across any number of information technology regimes. Now, a third implication, and here's where there's some separation that's interesting between my paper and Sam's, maybe for the worse for my paper, but it seems to me that we might think of the 20th century's information systems in the 20th century as having something like Thomas Piketty's U-shaped curve, which is what I propose at near the end of the paper. A world of disastrous misrepresentation at the beginning of the 20th century, culminating once again in disastrous misrepresentations in the early 21st century, with a world of more controlled and contained public sphere in the middle of the 20th century. Now, Sam's paper really usefully and provocatively takes this U-shaped curve on and proposes a kind of continuity hypothesis across the period. Now, I think I would characterize the middle of the 20th century as a period in which the work of distortion is done instead by exclusions, such that Jim Crow's apartheid and the cutting off of immigration in the 1924 Immigration Act are ways of excluding the kinds of voices that produced information controversy in the early 20th century, and now again in our time. So I think of that moment as a moment of exclusion rather than distortion, if we were using a broad brush here and trying to characterize something like the basic functioning of the information economy. So many different First Amendment regimes, many different technological regimes consistent with misinformation, the U-shaped curve, and then last, and I'll get out of the way, is Lippmann and Baldwin have solutions that they offer to the crisis of misrepresentation. And those solutions are not, and this may be surprising, especially coming from Baldwin, who's about to found the ACLU, given the way the ACLU is remembered now, but their solutions are not First Amendment solutions or free speech solutions or individual rights solutions or civil liberties solutions. Their solutions are institutional, organizational, in the domain of political economy. And so for Lippmann, it takes the forms of various forms of expertise. I describe this as an administrative state emphasis, although Lippmann likes experts wherever he finds them, whether they're in corporations or in organizations that are nonprofit, or whether they're in the administrative state. But for Lippmann, it's the expert who holds out the hope of cutting through the chaos and the noise and producing something like a rational public sphere in the world of the mass, the world that he'd learned about from his teacher, Graham Wallas. And Baldwin hits on a different strategy, and you can take it from the fall of 1919 in Pittsburgh. The Baldwin strategy is industrial democracy. What will provide the institutional foundation, the framework for producing a robust and effective public sphere that's relatively immune, or at least a little bit more immune from the problem of distortion? It's the labor union that puts workers, everyday people, in touch with important questions that have real stakes, and connects them to that information through organizations that also have stakes and has skin in the game and can produce a better information environment. So what Baldwin will do across the course of the 20s is push a First Amendment, and here I'm borrowing from Laura Weinrib's amazing book from a few years ago, but push a First Amendment that's largely about labor radicalism and the production of a labor movement, which will be a better information space for running a democracy, what he would have called an industrial democracy. So we might think of those as things that we might focus on now, that is to say institutional solutions rather than First Amendment solutions.
Great, thank you. And one thing I thought was striking, and we'll definitely come back to this quite soon, is that in both your paper and Sam's, the solutions, which is in itself a fairly optimistic term for what we're dealing with here in terms of our future, the solutions really don't sound in First Amendment law or expressive rights at all for the most part. And we're going to come back to that. But first, I want to invite RonNell. RonNell and Sonja have had a long-standing and very fruitful partnership on their work, and RonNell is going to present their current paper. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Katy. And thanks to Genevieve and Jamil and everyone else at Knight for putting this remarkable group of thinkers together on this really pressing issue. As some of you know, and as Katy mentioned, Sonja and I have been at work for a few years now on a really large scale empirical study focused on the intersection between the United States Supreme Court and the press. We've gathered huge amounts of data, both quantitative and qualitative, about every reference by the court to the press function, ranging from those in press-specific opinions that are about the press to just passing references to the journalistic function that are happening in non-media cases. And we're investigating the court's characterizations by their justices, the judicial author, the term, the positive, negative, and neutral tone, and by their framing. And among the most interesting and most telling, we think, trends to emerge from all of this are the trends that we found in the frame of trustworthiness. And what we've seen here is an absolute plummet in tone, a court that once routinely went out of its way to emphasize that its starting point was that performers of the press function were well motivated and credible and public serving, now does nothing of the sort, instead offering characterizations that ascribe the opposite traits. And we see this in the disappearance of something that we've labeled the worthiness principle, this really sort of constant pattern for decades and decades after the incorporation of the First Amendment of depicting press speakers as worthy of trust because they were doing good things, because they were actually or potentially using their expression to advance good principles. The court once was routinely leading with these initial or overarching depictions of the press and its presumptively good aims and its public serving and democracy enhancing benefits. And now it does not do so. We also see it in the abandonment of something that we've sort of unsatisfyingly shorthanded the breathing space principle, where the justices once embraced this additional framework that sort of straight up acknowledges the potential lack of trustworthiness of individual members of the class of press speakers, but draws this protective bubble around the whole group, saying, you know, we err on the side of protection and benefit of the doubt when this is the kind of speech function that's going on. And this also doesn't appear at all in the Roberts Court data. And the drop off here is really unmistakable. Today, the court does not ever depict a performer of the press function as trustworthy. There are literally no such references, even broadly construed when we sweep to include not just legacy media, but any performance of the journalistic or press function by anyone. It's something that was once happening with real regularity, and now it's just gone. Now, there is an awful lot to unpack here. Our major project for the coming year is to do the hard work of considering all the moving parts, what might be driving this massive shift in characterization and what the shift in characterization might itself be causing. Among other things, we plan to slice and dice the data to try to explore with much more precision the role that judicial ideology does or does not play in this, the way that the data interacts with the changes that we see in other framings of the press, and especially the way that it maps onto the changing media landscape and changing public perceptions of press trustworthiness, with a real eye towards comparing our data arc to public polling data on press trustworthiness to see whether the court is a driver or a reflector of public perceptions in this space. That's a really big to-do list for us. We're keenly aware of it, but one discrete question that we thought we could ask at the outset is whether it is the case that this presumption of trustworthiness is just gone overall at the Supreme Court for all instances. If the court was just sort of out of the game of presuming trustworthiness altogether, if it had simply grown more cynical of the trustworthiness of all speakers, or had made some notable shift away from granting those presumptions to, say, speakers whose trustworthiness was argued to be questionable, that would be a helpful marker. But our survey of the wider jurisprudence suggests that this isn't what's going on. It is not the case that the justices have simply become less generous in presuming the trustworthiness of all speakers, or even in presuming it in for the types of speakers whose behavior might give rise to some kind of doubt about their worthiness of trust. In fact, in recent years, the justices of the Supreme Court have actively extended a presumption of trustworthiness to a wide range of speakers in spite of serious disagreement about the speaker's deservedness of such generosity. In cases across a number of sub-areas, it's pretty expansively embraced both the potential value of other expression and the presumptively good aims of other speakers. And we see it in this very powerful presumptive trustworthiness language from the court describing the value of corporate speakers in a recent spate of cases making positive presumptions about speakers expressing anti-abortion messages, in the broad protective approach for which all of the First Amendment scholars in the room are familiar, sort of safeguarding the rights of Westboro in the name of breathing space for political protest speakers, safeguarding Alvarez in the name of breathing space for valuable speakers on false speech, Ilanis in the name of breathing space for musicians and artists who might express violent messages, anonymous donors in the name of breathing space for nonprofit charities. We see in these cases language that echoes what we once saw on behalf of the press. This presumption of trustworthiness that moves the court to lead with the democracy enhancing and public serving depiction, and to protect the wider group in the name of protecting individual, even in the face of individual questions about trustworthiness of the motives within the group. These cases all stand in pretty stark contrast to the Roberts Court's abandonment of the presumption of trustworthiness for speakers who fill the press function. And we have a lot more questions than we have answers about the trends that we're seeing in the data and this important subset of the data in particular. But for purposes of today's event, I do think that it's notable that the sort of rhetorical framing and inclinations towards press speakers are strikingly divergent from the approach that the court seems to be taking when faced with a choice about presuming trustworthiness of other kinds of expressive actors. And it sits somewhat uneasily within the wider framework of the speaker trust expansion that is often touted as a flagship of the Roberts Court. So we're really interested in thinking about the intersection of this with some of the things that are happening later today, but also thinking about the way that it situates itself within the historical context that the other two panelists on this historian panel have. Really excited to think about the interconnection.
Thank you. It's a really amazing project and a massive project. I'm looking forward to seeing your feature papers as well. So before I start us off with a question, I just wanted to see if anyone has any initial reactions to each other's papers or presentations that you wanted to get out at the beginning.
I mean,
I
don't want to monopolize
Please do.
the conversation. I guess I would like to draw out RonNell and Sonja a little on just preliminary thoughts about what are the causal drivers. I mean, there's sort of Amy Gajda's stuff on the First Amendment bubble sort of says the press has kind of been misbehaving.
Yeah.
Your story makes it seem much more like a political project. I mean, there's a sort of long history that right-wing speech claims are much more effectively protected at the court than left-wing speech claims. I don't know, there are other models too, presumably.
Right. I mean, and it's worth noting that it might be that both of those things could simultaneously be happening. That is, that the press is viewed as less trustworthy because it is less trustworthy. And also that something ideological is driving the notion. Sonja and I were actually talking in the cab right over here about how part of what might be going on is just that any individual justice on the Supreme Court, when they think about the press, the conservative justices on the Supreme Court are thinking about the New York Times and the Washington Post and thinking, you know, I don't really think that that's a sort of a trustworthy entity. And the progressive justices on the Supreme Court are thinking about Fox News and conservative talk radio and are thinking that's not a particularly trustworthy entity. And what's getting lost in the midst, part of what we did was deliberately design our project not to capture the press, but to capture the press function, just preservation of the operation of the press function. And it seems that there's no one left to be a defender of the core function that is taking place. Causers and the causal chain is tricky, but I think that both the sort of trend that Amy Gaida thinks about, the sort of First Amendment bubble notion, could be happening simultaneously to some ideological pulls that lead to a really toxic intersection.
Yeah, I'll just add on to that. And one of the things RonNell mentioned when we continue to dig into both this trustworthiness data and plus other parts of the project is that from what we've sliced and diced so far, you know, ideology only is a partial explainer, if at most. And so what we found, at least with trustworthiness, is that it is just not the case that we have the more liberal-leaning justices who are still out there, you know, waving the flag for the importance of the press. And it's just that we have a tilt toward the right, and that's why we're seeing this change in tone. They are not doing this either. It is not there. And this is, again, a stark change from what we saw in earlier decades, where we did have the Justice Brennan and the Justice Black, and yes, liberal-leaning justices who were out there, you know, very frequently making these kinds of comments, and then even more rightward ideologically leaning justices who would still, maybe not as often, or maybe a little more with a mixed tone, but at times at least still express these kinds of things. And so the fact when our data came back and we saw that it was just sort of this across this board change in tone and sort of erasure from making these kinds of statements, it was very stark to us.
Thank you. So this sort of theme of declining trust in the press, declining trust in institutions more generally, I think leads in well to one of the things I have been wondering about, which is this concept of the omnicompetent citizen, or the myth thereof, as Walter Lippmann thinks of it. So if I'm stating this correctly, and the Lippmann expert should correct me if I'm wrong, the idea here is that our society is too complex, even as of 1920, was too complex for a citizen to be able to obtain all of the information and expertise they would need on every subject that was of public relevance in discourse, that was simply impossible. And so there needed to be other ways, other mechanisms of citizens to be informed, to be able to participate in self-government effectively, but it simply was out of the question to really learn everything there was to know anymore. One thing that struck me as I was reading this and some of the other papers is that, you know, that sort of sense of despair that it's too complicated for anyone to really get their head around everything goes back much farther than 1920. I mean, in Eugene Volok's paper, which we're going to talk about later today, he quotes a judge from 1799 who's weighing in on a rebellion, the Fries Rebellion, I don't know how you say it, and he's basically saying the same thing. He's like, you know, people are so susceptible to public opinion, they can't possibly understand all the facts of what's happening around them. So this goes back a long way. But in both John and Sam's paper, the protagonists in those stories don't think that the press is necessarily the best way for citizens, for the common citizen, to get that level of knowledge. So John, maybe could you talk a little bit about in your paper what the view is?
It's true that it's interesting that a paper that proposes finds in history, but that's what the historian does. The historian doesn't propose, rather they find in history. So I found just accidentally in history, institutional strategies for managing information in the public sphere, but not strategies around the press, or at least those aren't in the paper. Baldwin has a split strategy through the 20s. I come to this because I'm writing a book about Baldwin's other institutional project in the 20s, which is running a philanthropic foundation to support left and liberal causes, largely pushing his labor movement project, but also trying to support a new set of sources of press and information. He founds a publishing house. He founds an alternative to the news services, an alternative to the Associated Press, which is an effort to get labor news out there. So he is experimenting in some sense with observatories in the Lippmannian tradition. And Lippmann's an advisor to the fund, which brings him into the conversation. So there are experiments in the press, but I think the project of the labor project, the industrial democracy project, is to get inside the intimate conversations that citizens have with one another, and be able to create a space, an institutional space for the flourishing of the reception of the information. And that's where I think Baldwin and Lippmann come together. Lippmann, after all, is interested in the stereotypes in our heads, and Baldwin's strategy for that is not just the federated press, his press service, but also the idea of organizing people in places where there are real stakes that are immediate and closely connected.
Thank you. Sam, what about in your paper, this sort of view of how does the citizen get this knowledge that they need, or sort of what are the best ways to foster that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the key to the omnicompetent citizen is, as an idea in Lippmann, I mean, it's complicated in Lippmann, and he himself kind of moves over time in how he thinks about it. And it ends up, in his case, as a kind of critique of the capacities of individuals, that sort of people can't rationally make sense of enough information and have their prejudices, and he kind of moves in an undemocratic fashion later in his career. For me, the important point is it's actually not about reconceptualizing the individual citizen per se, but about realizing that like individuals, like no man, it's sort of a sophisticated version of no man is an island as an idea, right? That the formation of public opinion is social, it's collective, it's political. And the idea is rather than just kind of assume that we're atomized and that what the purpose of public opinion or democratic life is a sort of aggregation of kind of sort of spontaneously produced opinions, to pay attention to the kind of collective practices that allow opinions to emerge as part of a kind of social formation. And so I read the project that he's of sort of trying to rethink public opinion in a social liberalism or a new liberalism vein rather than a classical liberalism vein. And I think it's helpful today because we've kind of returned to a classical liberalist way of thinking about individual competence and citizenry under the kind of neoliberal turn, right? So a lot of the, sort of Lochnerized First Amendment arguments, starting with the Virginia pharmaceuticals case, all sort of presume that individuals have sort of extreme capacity to judge, and as long as all information is available to them, they'll rationally come to the best understanding. And the Lippmann critique is to say it's silly to expect every citizen to be able to be fully competent on every issue. Not that you could read that undemocratically, right? But I think the better way to read it would be to say anyone could potentially, were they to be interested in an issue, come to kind of the ability to judge those, which pharmaceutical is best for them. But if you don't kind of make sure that there are kind of guardrails up in certain ways, if there are not sort of collective mechanisms to allow people to sort of have experts that they can trust, and I think the key question is where you locate the experts. I mean, you have to have experts, but where do you locate them and how do you make them democratically accountable? That's the only way to produce competence among the public. And, it's interesting, the sort of neoliberal project, in many ways is built around the idea that the economy and everything is too complicated, that we could never rationally plan it, that the price mechanism is the best sort of system to make sense of the chaos of like freewheeling choice. But yet the kind of legitimation project under the sort of First Amendment law presumes complete citizen competence, right? I mean, the idea is that, well, if you just have enough information, you'll make the right choice, while the kind of broader governance project presumes that there's no possibility of ever having kind of mastery cognitively of the economy. And I think that's where just give up on the omnicompetent idea you can start to think more creatively about how to organize a public sphere.
Thank you. You know, RonNell and Sonja, you've written about this in a different paper, really, but the sort of to look at it from a slightly different angle. The court also makes certain assumptions about individual people's ability to obtain information and to process that information rationally. Do you want to say a little bit about that?
It does. There's a huge amount of rhetoric from the Supreme Court that focuses on presumptions that, not presumptions they're making about the press, but presumptions they're making about the audience of the press, presumptions they're making about the citizenry. And a lot of this rises and falls on a sort of marketplace of ideas notions, right? That all we all need is, if only there were just more information, if only there were just enough counter speech, and presupposing an individual citizen as truth seeker when the social science data demonstrates to us quite clearly. I mean, part of what's really interesting to me is that the work that I did in that piece is very Lippmannian, except it's just modern social science data, sort of modern behavioral cognitive science data demonstrating that not that our brains have changed, just that we presupposed things about the way that we processed information and engaged in truth seeking that isn't accurate, that we in fact engage in a wide variety of appropriate and necessary cognitive shortcuts, and that people are often driven by identity and by emotion and by other sorts of issues that make them limited in their information processing capacities, and not in any way, right, exactly the sort of, it sort of mirrors, it's really interesting, the parallels to what Sam's saying about the sort of historical view, which is that it isn't that we have to presume that people are incapable of participating in an engaged way in their democracy, just that we have to live with the reality of what we can do in terms of information consumption. And that I know it's very, very unpopular to suggest to sort of be an advocate for gatekeepers. I know that this is not the moment in which advocacy for, and I want to acknowledge that particularly the press as gatekeeper did a terrible job in terms of excluding voices that we absolutely ought not to have been excluding from the sort of democratic public sphere. But in terms of the shaping of conversations, I think there's a really interesting dialogue to be had about the way that what we just now know about our cognitive capacities and how they've long been true. In some respects, Lippmann was prophetic in sort of his forward-looking anticipation of the kinds of conversations that we ought to be having. And the thing that melds my work with Sonja's in this space is that both of us are big believers that there is probably and a sort of deeply underconceptualized press function of the notion of sort of what we need from a protected press function is an acknowledgement of this individual citizen limitation, right? Just sort of starting premise that we do not have omnicompetent citizenry, that we instead have citizens who lack information competency and who are incapable, just it's mathematically impossible for us to do our own research on every matter that is in public dialogue. And so we need shapers of public information. We need trustworthy fact checkers. We need institutions who think of it as their obligation to gather and engage in dialogue that we can rely upon, and that the melding of those two threads, I think, is going to be a really interesting platform for ongoing conversation about what law and policy need to protect in order to shape those conversations going forward.
If I can just come in on that quickly, I mean, I think I mostly agree, but I have a couple of interesting points of slight difference on the way I'm thinking about these terms. So I think the one is, I'm a little hesitant to put a huge amount of loading on sort of the behavioral sort of psychological turn that's happened in a lot of political thinking, in a lot of economics, that I'm sort of less interested in sort of cognitive shortcomings. I mean, I think that's an interesting return to kind of pathologizing the citizen. I'm much more in favor of the sort of just like the mathematical social impossibility of handling, a very complicated society. And then following from that, I think thinking about the function of the media is really important here. And I think there's actually 3 different functions we have historically attributed to the media, and they're slightly different and they work in different ways. So the way that I've thought about them, that there's a kind of, we rely on the press or the media to curate a kind of national conversation, and that's been disaggregated after sort of the end of mass media, and I think disaggregated in productive ways. Like the conversation here, I'm in agreement, John, about the kind of U shape right at the bottom of the U. The reason that my paper focuses on those years is that's the hardest case for still showing a lot of misinformation. But that was, that conversation was curated around a whole set of racial and sort of like imperialist and, capitalist norms that are not ideal. That's been opened up in productive ways. The second is to provide a space for the expression of opinion, right? And this is sort of something that is sort of that's 1A, right? That you want to sort of see a range of people having a discussion and like get exposed to different ideas. That too has been democratized in a really productive way. But the third function is to produce information, right? The sort of the journalism function rather than the commentary function. And that's the one that's completely collapsed economically, all right? And so this is not about asking for the return of a press function as a gatekeeper or a curator of a national conversation, but just about ensuring that a basic level of information is being produced so it's accessible to that conversation wherever that conversation is happening. And that's the one that I'm most concerned about, and that I think that institutional fixes are possible. And then after that, all the rest of the work is politics. And, that's fine.
Yes. And most particularly, I'll just sort of maybe give a 3AB, which is, the court's depiction of this function, and I think accurately so, is that a big piece of that production of information, if we're honing in on the democracy serving press function, a big piece of the production of information that we expect from the press is sort of watchdoggery, right? It's accountability enhancement, the asking of questions that we ourselves wouldn't ask, the checking for information that we ourselves wouldn't engage in, the sitting in on the criminal trial that we all have a constitutional right to attend, but won't go and attend and watch. That performance of the press function, right? There are plenty of entities that are engaged in what I think of as repeatage, but not a whole lot of entities that are engaged in reportage. And you must have reportage in order to have an informed democratic sphere. And it's that decline of that press function that it is through the performance of that 1 and 2 happen. The shaping of public dialogue happens because the information gatherers know all of the information and then shape for us which things, they prioritize for us which things might be most important. But I think the lack of number 3, the democratizing of that, that's a myth, right? We are not all going to go down and sit in on the criminal trial or the hearing. And so no one's going to do it. And then we lack the conversations that are necessary to self-governance.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in on there. Sorry, but part of what I found so interesting about John and Sam's papers, because I think it is often a very lost part of this whole conversation, is that we, as you were saying, we usually go sort of an assumption that we are overloaded with information, that people have too much information today and we don't know how to process it. And we need the gatekeepers, we need the experts, we need the people. And that's certainly part of the conversation. But there is this very important part of the conversation, which is Sam particularly was talking about, where we just do not have the information that we have. And I think the collapse of local news is just such a perfect example of that. I live in a small college town that has, really had a decimated news landscape, and I never know anything about what's going on. I don't know what my city government is doing. I don't know why there's some big construction project going somewhere. I don't know what all the sirens I heard were, right? And when COVID hit, nobody knew what was going on. Nobody knew how many people were in the hospital. Nobody knew. The rumors are everywhere. We just didn't have the information that we would have had a few decades ago. The information is just no longer there, and I do think it is a key key part of separating this. We have all sorts of opinions, as you were talking about. We have all sorts of repeatage of people saying the same things, but often this core information flow, which I think RonNell and I talk about as part of the key press function. You can call it something else if you want, but that is a key thing that needs to be protected, that is very different from how we often think of the individual right of speakers, of the individual freedom to be able to say things, the idea of having sort of the input and this right we have. And I do think, and I've written this in other places, it's really helpful to think of this perhaps more through a collective lens, this collective interest we have in the information flow, that even if I personally may not know the information, I have a part of a collective interest in having other people in my community have that information, because it does have this effect on me. And I think that is really a very important part of this conversation.
It might be that an additional dysfunction to the information production problem, which now RonNell and Sonja and Sam are all talking about, might be, I think, an overemphasis on the First Amendment. Can I say that at the night?
Yes.
Yes.
Safe space.
All right. Right. Okay. And the way that would work, and here law schools are implicated more generally, I think, we live, I think, in a golden era of journalism about the U.S. Supreme Court. I mean, the number of Anthony Lewises who now exist, right? I'm thinking of like the 60s era New York Times coverage of the Supreme Court has now spread, and from Dahlia Lithwick to Nina Totenberg to Linda Greenhouse to Adam Liptak, we have a whole bunch of really expert, excellent, super insider reporters on the US Supreme Court. I think part of the reason for that is it's easy and cheap for newspapers to sustain reporting on the US Supreme Court. There are 9 of them. and you can, and all you need is like one insider who leaks a little bit, and you can tell. Whereas the Congress or the administrative state, these are incredibly complex things to report on. They require teams of reporters. I mean, so we are able in the elite law schools and the Washington Post and the New York Times to produce excellent reportage about one of our branches, and that's the First Amendment branch. And so we can hear about Citizens United. We have endless debates about it, while I don't know, the effect of the Wagner Act on labor organizing is just too much. So I think that's put another feature of this.
Yeah, I'd agree with that completely. And the political economy side of the newsrooms makes a lot of sense. The other way to think about it is Lippmann says that the news is an index of social organization, right? I mean, the news tends to report on already existing institutions, right? That's sort of the way it does its work. And it goes to the places where there's activity happening that it can then report on. I mean, the way I think about this often is how much like Apple product launches end up on the front page of the paper, because these are kind of stylized as events to be reported on. And in sort of the broader dysfunction of American democracy, one of the few sites that actually has meaningful binding consequences is the Supreme Court. So it's also, that is producing events of meaningful governance in a way that a lot of the other branches are not. So, I mean, this speaks to John's broader arguments about like Baldwin and Lippmann's vision, which is to say, if you want better news, you need a better organized and more politically engaged society. You can't kind of start with the news, you need to start with the organizations, and then the organizations will provide information that the news can report on. So yeah, I agree completely, but it would also emphasize that we think a lot about the discourse, we think a lot about law, particularly in settings like this, but the biggest problems are, I think, politics generally, right? And that sort of transition of news into a kind of reality show, a kind of ever-present reality show that doesn't feel like people are engaged at a particularly close level. And the Supreme Court is maybe the most extreme version of that. I mean, it's 9 very distant figures writing in kind of impenetrable prose to the average reader, making decisions that have, consequences. But how do you lobby the Supreme Court? I mean, how do you get involved democratically? It's impossible to know. It just sort of feels like, the Politburo handing down a new read on the great texts of Marx. So anyway, an agreement.
I'm very sorry, Sam and John, that if you are going to speak ill of the First Amendment, this room will have no choice but to cancel you. We'll just, but I think it's a really interesting insight that both of you have about the court as a producer of discrete news events, which are harder to come by in some respect. Right? It's very interesting to think that something as esoteric as a 150-page Supreme Court opinion with lengthy dissents that is really the epitome of something that is not digestible by the average American citizen, right? If what we did was just hand down a 150-page opinion in an abortion opinion or a Second Amendment opinion, that's not it's a thing for which we rely on expert translation, right? Someone to grab it and describe it to us and package it and depict it. But because it does happen in single instances where it's, the Supreme Court today handed down Obergefell, and here's what it means for gay marriage, we tend to elevate those opinions in our culture war dialogue in ways that we never would a nuanced debate that's happening at Congress, for example.
So this cues us up well, I think, for one last point before we move to audience Q&A. And a reminder for those of you watching online, you can submit your questions in the YouTube chat and I can incorporate them as well. But Sam, in your paper, you talk quite a bit about, if not solutions, then ways forward for restoring streams of news, as you put it. So I was wondering if you could expand on that a little bit, particularly about political observatories and some of your other ideas there.
Yeah. So, I mean, the idea is, if the main problem is this sort of lack of information being produced, and that's really sort of a market failure, the news market, the news economy is not productive of reporting. It's too expensive. It's much cheaper to hire journalists to do commentary or reaction pieces or like comment on the Twitter takes. Some other mechanism needs to be found to support that reporting and investigative function. One of the benefits of the digital era was supposed to be, and actually is, although we've forgotten about it, that it's radically reduced the costs of distribution and production for news. So, newsrooms used to put most of their money into newsprint and delivery trucks. It's actually not that hard now to hire, like on the ProPublica model, a small team of journalists to do reporting. You could imagine rolling that out, at scale through public funding, locating in universities is where Lippmann thought they could have gone in 1919. That still seems viable. And that, you're sort of just seeding money into organizations whose job it is to cover local politics, to do various types of reporting. And that then kind of will create information that can kind of flow up the media ecosystem. I think the benefit of it is, in my mind, there's many benefits, but the most important conceptual benefit is that it leaves alone any effort to kind of regulate the expressive sphere, and it leaves alone the press as a counterweight to government. I mean, you're not trying to create new newsrooms with sort of op-ed pages. You're trying to just seed reporting, right? The production of information, and sort of put that back into the news economy and ecosystem. I think that's an important thing to be done. I think it also has the benefit of kind of sidestepping a lot of the First Amendment debates that you might want to have about trying to, I just don't think you want to try to expel unproductive speech from the media landscape for a variety of reasons. I think it wouldn't work, but I also think it's just like politically non-sensible to it'll just amp up the culture wars. A broader kind of project of getting people re-engaged with what's going on requires this kind of reporting.
Sam, can I ask, sorry, Katy, but
go ahead.
Something that I was thinking as I was reading your paper is about the sort of way that this layers onto the things that Sonja and I are trying to explore about presumptions of trustworthiness. And I wonder whether, so I feel like I have a concern about the broader diminishment of trustworthiness in knowledge institutions more broadly. Just part of this is a sort of, I think, calculated piece of a political populist agenda to sort of diminish institutions of trust. And so, scientists, but university, right? So if you for example, if universities are a piece of the answer, and if people also don't trust universities, or if people also don't have, if we've diminished the the contact points, local news, for example, right? People had relationships of trust with their local news organizations, and now there are so many fewer of those. What concrete tools should we be engaging in to try to rebuild those relationships of trust? The generation of useful information doesn't get us the distance if there isn't a like a recipient on the other end who thinks of the institution the institution that's doing the generating as worthy of trust.
Yeah, I mean, this is a super difficult question about rebuilding trust in governance. I mean, this is the broader project of like a union is a useful device if it's responsive and actually engaged. I mean, these are the kind of, you've got to be trying to do things with the information and find out if that information is useful and accurate to you in whatever project you're engaged with. I think it's important here not to think that if we're going to if you put the money into these institutions, that all of a sudden everyone would start subscribing. If there was a market for it, the market would be providing it. I mean, the idea is you sort of need to subsidize just to have someone sitting in the kind of local police oversight board to kind of keep a record of what's going on. And then if there's an organization, as there have been in the last couple of years, there are social movements that are invested in taking on issues of police brutality or police abuses or trying to think through that question. There's a record of information that they can go to and consult and a kind of common set of references. So the question of how you get to trust is about people actually becoming engaged in sort of social movements and then finding the information of use. My concern is this is like a bare minimum sort of requirement that we just make sure there's information being recorded and kept. I think it has downstream effects of kind of accountability and kind of checking. It would be like, these would also be jobs that would help kind of boost the journalism industry and kind of stop the erosion of professional norms in other newsrooms. But I'm not expecting that all of a sudden everyone's going to hit subscribe and that'll be the solution. It's just to create the information. And then the rest is politics. I mean, I do think one of my when I was thinking about this paper, I mean, it's worth remembering how much of the American electorate doesn't vote, right? I mean, there's a third didn't vote in the last, most important election of our lifetimes. And so, there's a lot of room for re-engaging the American public in democratic politics. So small d democratic politics, big D democratic politics too. But you need basic sources of information and sort of local contact points to start to build that trust.
Yeah, I mean, that third of Americans who doesn't vote, the optimistic view is that it's just a matter of engaging them, right? I mean, the fear is that most Americans just don't care that much about politics. You see this reflected fairly consistently in public opinion polling, that most Americans just don't follow it that closely and are just not that interested. And that is in some ways an even harder nut to crack. But why don't we get the audience engaged at this point? Who has questions? Please raise your hand. Please go ahead.
Thanks. I just wanted to pick up on a thread in both John and Sam's presentation that the contemporary problem of free speech has distinctively 20th century material preconditions, right? So I guess I just wanted to flag two and get your thoughts on them. The first is mass society, which appears in John's abstract, but not so much in his presentation. I mean, that's an immensely contested sociological concept, and it'd be good to get a sense of like what the relevant meaning is. And the second is kind of the recurring appearance of American liberalism as a kind of protagonist or as a kind of like underlying class interest or what have you as in these debates. You can think of the Palmer raids and the Red Scare as perhaps a progenitor of the 20th century free speech discourse. So nice to get a view on that. And you can think of this contemporary pessimism as maybe not just a reflection of, but a playing out of, the conflict between technocratic liberal elites and their discontents. So yeah, mass society and liberalism as the sort of background giants of the free speech debate.
Take it away, John.
Well, maybe one way of extending your intervention about mass society is to observe that that the debates about information, the end of the 1910s and early 1920s, are debates happening in a particular time and place of industrial production. There's a very particular industrial model, and now this is the mass society point, there are very particular and contested ways of conceptualizing what that stage of industrial production means and what it means for social relations among human beings, right? That's the with liberalism as one, as actually many. Liberalism has many different ways of trying to make sense of that, and so are various socialisms or visions of social democracy, or like also circulating in this moment. And I guess a thing that might connect Sam's paper and mine is the effort, and we're hardly alone in this, to re-inject political economy into and the social as a problem to be explored into the analysis of information problems in our democracy. I think that's the I'm really just restating back to you what you said, but excited to hear it. It means we're in the same conversation at least.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd just add to that my thoughts about liberalism in mass society follow Dewey and the smartest people in the interwar years thinking about this question, which was to say that liberal priors in a kind of mass industrialized economy, given mass inequality, requires something that would now be called social democracy or even socialism in the US, right? That you need to not think purely about individuals in a kind of negative liberties vein and their expressive rights alone, but you need to deal with the kind of totality of their social life. And that's where most of the work will actually be required. And I happen to think that a pretty strong First Amendment is a necessary part of that project, and it actually legitimates a lot of the project as long as it's tied pretty closely to the expressive function, right? So I'm a sort of an absolutist around not censoring political speech. The problem is that the concept of what speech is has been so radically inflated and is kind of crept as part of a political project that it's made that murky. And I think one of the risks at the moment is that in an effort to make sort of the First Amendment, I think the First Amendment is necessary, but not sufficient for democratic politics. I think so much politics now is trying to make the First Amendment both necessary and sufficient that it's actually led people trying to make it sufficient to start to question whether it's necessary in a kind of absolutist vein, right? And to start to try to roll back protections to speech because the First Amendment's been used in these other settings. So that's my answer.
Genevieve, you had your hand up.
Hello, hi. I've really enjoyed this conversation. Actually, what Sam just said is a great segue to my question, which is to push both John and Sam, I think, to more on the extent to which you are criticizing First Amendment doctrine or the extent to which you're just arguing for something outside of First Amendment doctrine. I mean, this is actually a question for all of you, but I think the critique in Sonja and RonNell's paper of the First Amendment doctrine is clearer. But one way to think about, to tie all the papers together, one way to think about the shift that Sonja and RonNell are talking about, one explanation that seems plausible to me, at least partially, is that the court has shown less solicitude to the press freedom. And, even as the speech clause has gotten bigger and bigger, because press freedom has always been understood as a somewhat positive liberty, and speech is a negative liberty. Speech is about keeping that government's hands off, but for the press to exist, you need all kinds of entailments. It's a positive function. You need to give special privileges to a particular class. You have to recognize that they need certain kinds of resources. And over the course of the last 40 years, there's been increasingly sort of making increasingly negative liberties conception of freedom of speech and maybe the democratic ends that it's supposed to achieve. So if we have that frame, there's a way in which I think it's interesting both John and Sam continue to, I think, assume a certain fixity to the limits of the First Amendment and then say, but we're talking about something outside of the First Amendment. That's not necessarily the case. I mean, you could think about the Wagner Act, for example. I think about the Wagner Act as a free speech law, like a non-First Amendment free speech law, but it's only non-First Amendment because the court in the early 20th century was really uncertain about the constitutional status of labor protections and unclear about whether they should fit within or outside the First Amendment. And in particular, John, your paper, I mean, there's a way in which, so you're talking about developments that are occurring outside of this language of constitutional law and outside of constitutional discourse, but not necessarily so. And so you could read your paper saying, well, when we're thinking about creation of a healthy democratic public sphere, when we're thinking about free speech, we have to go beyond the First Amendment. But you might also say, actually, the court got it wrong. It had an unduly negative, unduly simplistic conception of what free speech and what the First Amendment looked like. And this entire tradition is founded on a failure to recognize the threat of propaganda, that the lesson that Holmes and Brandeis and then later the New Deal court took from the experience of World War I and the great propaganda machines, but also the labor struggle, were the wrong lessons. And we should, from the beginning, have had a less negative liberty conception of the First Amendment. But that's not the vein that you take. So I'm just curious to the extent to which all of this is a critique of how we think about freedom of speech and how we think about the First Amendment, or simply an argument that we need to think beyond the First Amendment.
Well, there's so much in this. I mean, first of all, I think we should, we could note on the side that there are some First Amendment cases where these two things come together squarely. I'm thinking of the public sector union dues cases like Janus, right? And so that's just the union and the labor movement and the First Amendment together, right? And so there, obviously, the construction of the labor movement is being shaped by the First Amendment, but the further question you ask, and well, one might think of the negative conception of the First Amendment, the negative liberties conception, which I agree is surging and dominates the case law now. One might think of that as an index of things going on elsewhere in society. So it'd be a good place to find it. And actually, RonNell and Sonja's paper is doing that with the Supreme Court and using the Supreme Court as a set of texts for figuring out how we're thinking about the press and other actors in important ways. So it might be an index, but there's also a risk, I think, and so now here's some pushback, I think, a risk in, well, everything is communication. But this is part of the problem of the First Amendment, is that one has to then figure out how to distinguish among different forms of communication, since almost everything happens in the form of communication. But this is why the entire regulatory state is at risk from a certain form of First Amendment. Communication is everywhere. So we could describe the First Amendment as everything. It's always available to us to make that move. One sees constitutional lawyers doing this with constitutionalism generally. So the labor movement might be an experiment in constitutionalism. And I have found myself a little skeptical of this move. This move seems to be a kind of move to expand the jurisdiction of the law professor a little bit. That is to say, all of a sudden, all of our forms of politics start to sound like the kinds of things that are in a casebook. And I find myself resisting that a little bit. It's a way of taking the politics of the streets about the labor movement and bringing them into Jerome Green Hall, which of course is kind of the place that I like to be. So I get the move. So I think I would resist. I mean, although of course the project of doing industrial democracy could be described as a constitutional project, and in some sense it is. And I would be happy to describe it that way with a super lowercase c, so long as it doesn't mean somehow that the Supreme Court's going to have more authority over it. And then I don't know what the special jurisdiction of the law professor is. That's sort of a...
Yeah, I think I agree with that completely. I mean, in some sense, it's a question of political strategy. I mean, I think where's the best place? I wrote a book that tried to imagine positive ideas about what the First Amendment would mean in the press freedom clause. And, in some ways that was a losing historical development, because the people who made the arguments were the newspaper industry, and they had the clout institutionally, politically, economically to sort of bend the First Amendment in their interests. And we shouldn't forget that the newspaper industry in the mid-20th century was a conservative force in American politics, by and large. It was sort of right-leaning. Everyone used to agree there was a mainstream media that was biased, and that it was biased to the right, until that got flipped on its head in the 70s. So I think at the point that you could effectively make arguments sort of around the things that we're talking about under the banner of the First Amendment, you probably wouldn't need to be making them under the banner of the First Amendment constitutionally. You'd be able to affect them through other political channels where they'd have more legitimacy. And I just worry, I think it's in similar terms as that John is framing it, that trying to find constitutional arguments is to try to do an end run around some of the political work that I think is more necessary. And so for the same reason, I would be interested in the project, but skeptical about it in sort of the order of operations.
Yeah, for all of the reasons that you described in your opening remarks about the obvious intersections between public perceptions of the free speech and press and the court's perceptions of free speech and press. I think I am the piece of the project that Sonja and I are working on that I am most excited about sort of plumbing the depths of is this question of marking the trends. I mean, we're going to take the Gallup polls and the GSS polling and data. And they've been asking the exact same questions that we're asking about what the court's doing in terms of its characterizations. They've been asking those identical questions of the public for the better part of 70 years. And so I think it's going to be really telling to try to map whether what's happening is that the public's perception of the press turned downward and the court mirrored that, or whether what happened was that the court started speaking of the press as a less and less trustworthy institution and the public embraced those notions. And I think it's important and helpful. I mean, I'm interested in that question more broadly about the court and on lots of factors, and I think you are too. But I think asking and answering it in this space about our communications landscape is particularly important to think about who we trust and why we trust them, and the triangulation of this role that Sam's just been describing between public institutions and private institutions and audience members. It strikes me as really a critical piece of not just thinking about what's happened in the past, but about figuring out what the trajectory looks like for the future.
Okay, we're going to fit in one more question. Eugene.
They should be trusted. Today, if you ask people, do you trust what various, like pick an institution, is saying, especially about hot button issues, race, transgender issues, immigration, the Trump administration, the Biden administration, you'll have lots of people from both sides of the spectrum saying, we don't trust them and we have reason to distrust them. And now one possibility is, that's just reality and, we do the best we can. But one problem, I very much appreciate Sam's suggestion that there be funding for local news. I mean, I do think it's a public good that needs to be supported in some measure. I'm very far away from social democracy myself, but there are some things some public goods that need to be provided. The part of the problem, though, is let's play out the game. Somebody gets a grant for local news coverage, and some people say, well, this is biased. It's biased because it's all a bunch of white people or white people sympathizers, or it's biased because it's all a bunch of lefties who are not, think of themselves as part of the resistance to the existing government. So then either you have a situation where the funder government funder starts to attach conditions to the funding, which may themselves raise important First Amendment problems, especially if they're viewpoint-based conditions. Or perhaps if that's not so, the political support for this will dry up, especially if there's something that gets kind of a lot of public pushback. So how viable do you think this kind of support would be, important and necessary as we may agree it is, in an environment where lots of people think they have really good reason not to trust the media?
I mean, so there's two separate, I think, questions there. One is about political viability, and that I'm going to plead absolute ignorance. I mean, I think what I'm talking about is a local. Some of this would have to. I mean, maybe the funding is federal, but will have to be sort of allocated on a local basis. And I just don't have a sense of, I mean, I'm not even a citizen of the country, so I don't have a good sense of exactly what the local conditions would be that would allow something to be legitimate. The question about everyone's just going to instantly start critiquing it, I think is fine. I mean, I probably agree with that. But we already have all of that stuff, right? We already have all the X is biased, Y is not covering the issue that I care about, the endless debate of can you trust the experts? We already have all of that, and we don't have the information. I mean, I think on some level, I do think we have models of sort of endowed, relatively shielded knowledge production institutions of various sorts that are under attack in various ways. But do a pretty good job. I mean, peer review kind of processes work pretty well, right? That can work, and they need just sort of enough cover to be allowed to do their business. And what I'm imagining, if the way that you were to set these up, and it would require mainly just having, people who are really committed to some vision of objectivity, as flawed as that is, as a kind of general concept, really committed to, we're going to do reporting. We're not going to do analysis or commentary. That's something that can happen in other channels. And we have plenty of those, which I think also the highly diversified sort of opinion economy gives these kind of institutions more legitimacy, because we're not relying on them to both do kind of editorializing and to do reporting. We're saying, there's a lot of other avenues to do critique. So my job here is just to kind of create some baseline information and add to the stream. And I think by scaling back your expectations of how many people are going to be reading them and what they're going to be doing, you lower some of the legitimacy crises. And, the idea is that in some ways they would be fairly anonymous institutions, just kind of feeding work up the sort of ecosystem, up the food chain. That would be my hope. And then I think the argument actually has to be made on sort of public, partly on public knowledge grounds, but I think it's also an economic investment. I mean, just treat it as a form of infrastructure, right? Trickle that you're going to say money we spend on this in these communities is money that will then trickle through the local economy in various ways. And, it's an investment, it's a stimulus program. And that would add to the kind of logic for doing it as well.
Eugene's question brings out one possible virtue of the labor mobilization strategy that I've futilely thrown out there, which is to say the labor union is not neutral. It's not objective. It doesn't purport to be. It's on your side. It's on your side. That's a different model for thinking about how to organize information and produce information intermediaries.
Thank you. We're out of time, but this was really excellent and a great way to start us off for the day. I hope we'll pick up some of these themes in the next panels. Thank you all so much for joining us and for doing this. We're going to take a quick break for coffee now, and then we're going to be back in here no later than 11:15.